My piece starts with a solo bass. There are other pieces that do it, but it's not really the typical solo instrument that's used in the orchestra. I was just interested in the bass and wanted to kind of do something different with the start of the piece. My name is Benjamin Webster, and my piece is titled Autumn Movement. I wouldn't say that it depicts autumn. It's more, I guess, a kind of reflection on how autumn is a sort of representation of change in many different guises. While I was writing the piece, I was just reflecting on changes that were happening in my own life and changes that were happening in the world around me. And so the piece is sort of, I would say, like an emotional response to thinking about change in all the different ways it kind of appears in our lives. There's lots of very sort of delicate textures and some slightly non-standard playing techniques. The flute players have to do this thing called flutter tongue, where they make a kind of rustling sound on their flute, or clarinets do these techniques called timbre trills, where they'll do a sort of alternate kind of fingering that makes just a little fluctuation in the sound. So little things like this that are very light and delicate, that are maybe not the usual way that these instruments are played.
He says it actually doesn't have anything to do with autumn, but I feel everything in the piece is autumnal. The sound of it, it's like you feel like the memory of rustling leaves, and there's something about it that feels nostalgic to me and transparent. There's a kind of lightness to the textures. It gets to a big climactic moment, but in general it has a kind of transparent, fragile quality to the textures that he's creating.
I'm from Wrentham, Massachusetts, which is a small town outside of Boston, like halfway between Providence and Boston. And my first sort of musical experiences, at least in the sort of like in classical music, were playing the clarinet. I sort of started playing clarinet in the 4th grade and continued to play clarinet through my undergrad.
Just to be a little bit more careful in the beginning at J as the violin.
I did my undergrad at the University of Miami, where my main teacher there was Lansing McCloskey, he was like very encouraging there. I went to the University of Southern California for my master's, where I studied with Andrew Norman and Nina C. Young and Donald Crockett. And then I'm currently finishing up a doctorate at the Yale School of Music. I started this piece just messing around, trying to come up with ideas, and I came up with a texture from a flute and cello piece of mine by sort of like stretching it out and layering different sort of cuts of it on top of each other. On my computer, I wanted to go through the exercise of like, okay, well, if I imagined this very electronic music sounding texture for orchestra, like what would that be like? And that became the end of the piece, and that was sort of actually the first thing I wrote. And then from there, things emerged out of that ending section.
We start with a solo double bass that has total freedom, which moves then into some woodwinds that have, it's clearly notated, but it sounds as if they have the same kind of freedom. He operates with that in just a perfect kind of timing, where the listeners would think there needs to have something that has a little bit more structure. Then he adds that when it needs to. And it really becomes rhythmically very precise, and the texture is suddenly completely different. And then there's just something in us humans that would like to return to where things began. And he's doing this in his piece as well. So at the end, you will hear like a little cadenza again, where the solo bass would remind us of the beginning. And there's just something beautiful about that whole structure of his.
I've never worked with a professional orchestra before. This is like my very first time hearing it played by professional musicians. It's just really meaningful to be in a performance situation where so much time and resources and care is put towards our music. I think the Minnesota Orchestra is the rare orchestra that is interested in giving that kind of care and attention to what we're trying to do. So that's extremely meaningful to be a part of.